When two officers arrested her that day, they never imagined they would meet her again. This time, she would decide their fate. It was a warm afternoon in the heart of Maplewood, a quiet suburban town known for its tree-lined parks and peaceful neighborhoods. Camille Wright, a highly respected attorney, sat alone on a weathered wooden bench near the pond, a thick hardcover book resting in her lap. For once, she allowed herself a rare moment of solitude, soaking in the gentle rustling of the leaves and the distant laughter of children playing nearby. But that peace was shattered in an instant. The sharp screech of tires broke the tranquil air as a police cruiser pulled up abruptly to the curb. Two officers stepped out, their movements crisp, their expressions unreadable. Their eyes scanned the area, then locked onto Camille. She was the only one sitting alone. And suddenly, she was a suspect.
Before we dive into today's story, we'd love your support. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your engagement helps us create more inspiring stories just for you. Now, without further ado, let's get started.
Camille Wright had always believed in the power of the law. She had spent years navigating courtrooms, advocating for justice, and ensuring that the rights of the voiceless were heard. But on that warm afternoon in Maplewood Park, she was simply a woman enjoying a quiet moment with a book. She sat on a weathered wooden bench, shaded by the sprawling branches of an old oak tree. The sun reflected off the rippling pond before her, and the rhythmic sounds of joggers' footsteps, children's laughter, and rustling leaves created a soothing backdrop. For once, she allowed herself to be still, her fingers gently turning the pages of her novel. Then came the screech of tires. A police cruiser rolled to a stop near the curb. Its presence was jarring in the peaceful setting, an unexpected intrusion. Camille barely glanced up, assuming the officers were responding to an incident elsewhere in the park. But then she noticed their movements. Two uniformed officers, James Carter and Michael Dawson, stepped out of the vehicle. Their posture was stiff, their expressions unreadable, but their eyes were locked onto her. "Ma'am, may we have a word?" Carter's voice carried over the soft hum of the park, slicing through the tranquility. Camille looked up from her book, her brows slightly furrowing. There was no reason for them to be speaking to her, and yet, here they were. "Of course," she replied evenly, closing the book and setting it beside her. Dawson took a step forward, hands resting on his belt in a stance that was more dominant than necessary. "We received a call about some suspicious activity in the area. Can you tell us what you're doing here?" Camille blinked. Suspicious activity? She was sitting on a bench, in broad daylight, reading. She tilted her head slightly. "I'm just enjoying the afternoon. Is there a problem?" Carter exchanged a glance with Dawson, then turned back to her. "We'll need to see some ID." Something in Camille's chest tightened. The request itself wasn't illegal, but the implication behind it was clear. She wasn't causing a disturbance. She wasn't violating any laws. And yet, she was being asked to justify her presence in a public park. Still, she remained composed. She had spent years dealing with microaggressions and veiled biases. This was nothing new. Slowly, she reached into her bag, retrieved her driver's license, and handed it to Carter. He examined it longer than necessary, his eyes flicking back to her face as if searching for something. "Camille Wright," he read aloud. "What brings you to this part of town, Ms. Wright?" Camille exhaled, keeping her voice steady. "I live in this city." "Is there a reason you're questioning me?" Dawson crossed his arms. "Just routine." Routine. The word was almost laughable. Camille had handled enough racial profiling cases to recognize what was happening. She felt the weight of nearby onlookers, joggers slowing down, parents casting concerned glances, a teenager discreetly pulling out her phone. She made a conscious effort to keep her tone calm but firm. "I've provided my ID. Unless you have a legitimate reason to detain me, I'd like to continue my afternoon." The moment she said it, Carter's expression darkened. "You got a smart mouth, don't you?" he muttered, stepping closer. "We're just doing our job." "And I know the law," Camille replied. "I'm not breaking it by sitting on a bench." Dawson's fingers twitched near his belt. "Are you refusing to comply?" Camille held his gaze. "I have complied. I gave you my ID. I answered your questions. Now I'd like to be left alone." That was the tipping point. Carter reached for her arm. Camille recoiled, startled. "What are you doing?" "You're resisting," he snapped. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. A young woman lifted her phone higher, recording the moment as Dawson stepped in to help Carter force Camille onto her feet. "Stop resisting," Carter repeated, his voice rising. She wasn't resisting. She hadn't even moved. But none of that mattered. Cold metal bit into her wrists as the handcuffs snapped shut. The indignity of it burned in her chest, but she refused to let them see her break. As Carter guided her toward the police cruiser, she heard murmurs from the growing crowd. "She didn't do anything. Why are they arresting her? Someone call a lawyer." One voice rose above the rest. "I'm recording this." Camille turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto the young woman with the phone. For a moment, there was an unspoken exchange, a silent plea to keep documenting the injustice. Then the car door slammed. The inside of the police cruiser was cold and suffocating. The smell of leather and disinfectant filled her nose as she shifted against the hard seat, her wrists aching against the tight cuffs. She stared out the window, watching the park fade into the distance, her mind reeling at the absurdity of it all. She had spent years defending people from injustices like this, and now? The fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed overhead, casting an eerie glow on the dull grey walls. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, a cold sterility that only added to the weight pressing on Camille's chest. She stood in the booking area, her wrists raw from the handcuffs that had just been removed. A camera flashed in front of her face. Mugshot. Another officer grabbed her hand, pressing each of her fingers onto an ink pad before rolling them onto a fingerprint sheet. Standard procedure, as if she were a criminal. Camille had been in police stations before, but always on the other side of the process. As an attorney, she had spent years defending clients who had faced wrongful arrests. Now, she was the one being processed. A sharp chuckle rang out from behind the desk. "Well, look at that," one of the officers sneered, scanning the computer screen. "Big shot lawyer, huh? Guess the law doesn't mean much when you're the one in cuffs." Camille clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay silent. Another officer handed her a form. "Sign here. You're being charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer." Her breath hitched. Obstructing? Resisting? She had done nothing of the sort. She looked up, meeting his gaze with an icy stare. "On what grounds?" The officer smirked. "Take it up in court." Camille exhaled slowly, willing herself to stay composed. This wasn't the time to argue. Not yet. Hours crawled by before she was finally released on bail. When she stepped outside into the cool night air, a familiar car was waiting by the curb. Denise Miller, her best friend and longtime colleague, rushed toward her. "Camille!" Camille barely had time to react before Denise pulled her into a tight hug. "Are you okay?" Denise asked, her voice a mixture of worry and anger. Camille nodded, but her hands trembled. "I'm fine." The words felt hollow. Denise led her to the car, and as they drove away from the station, silence settled between them. The streetlights flickered past in a blur, casting long shadows across Camille's face. Finally, Denise spoke. "This is bullshit, Camille. You shouldn't have been in there." Camille let out a dry laugh. "Tell me about it." She stared out the window, watching the city move past her. She had been humiliated, stripped of her dignity, and for what? Sitting on a park bench? Her fingers curled into fists. "I'm not letting this slide, Denise. Not this time." Denise's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What are you thinking?" Camille turned to her, her voice firm. "I have the tools, the knowledge, the resources. I'm going to fight back." That night, sleep was impossible. Camille sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by open law books, legal pads, and a fresh cup of coffee that had gone cold. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from sheer determination, as she began drafting a civil rights lawsuit against officers Carter and Dawson and the police department. She laid out every detail: the wrongful arrest, the fabricated charges, the racial profiling. This wasn't just about her. This was about a system that enabled and protected officers who abused their power. Then came the video. Denise texted her a link to a social media post. "Camille, you need to see this." Camille clicked it. Her own arrest stared back at her, recorded from a bystander's phone. The footage was crystal clear: her calm demeanor, the officer's escalating aggression, the unjustified handcuffing. The post had already been shared thousands of times. She scrolled through the comments. "This is disgusting. She did nothing wrong. Racial profiling at its finest. I hope she sues the hell out of them." Her inbox flooded: emails, calls, messages. People she had never met before reached out, sharing their own stories of injustice. A retired teacher arrested while waiting for a bus. A young black man slammed against a patrol car for looking suspicious. A mother handcuffed in front of her children for questioning an officer's rudeness. The pattern was unmistakable. Camille sat back, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of voices calling for change. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion creeping in, but her resolve only grew stronger. She would not let this case fade into another forgotten statistic. She would not let those officers walk away without consequence. And most importantly, she would not let the system keep operating in silence. Taking a deep breath, she picked up her pen and continued writing. This wasn't just a legal battle. This was a fight for justice. The conference room at Wright and Miller Law was tense. The partners sat around the long mahogany table, their faces tight with concern. Camille could feel the weight of their hesitation even before anyone spoke. "Camille, we understand why you're doing this," said Thomas Avery, the firm's senior partner. "But this is a high-profile case, and the media attention could damage our reputation." Camille folded her arms. "So what do you suggest? That I stay quiet? That I just let this go?" "We're suggesting discretion," another partner interjected. "Think about the firm, about your career." Camille felt her pulse quicken. "This isn't just about me. This is about holding the system accountable." She let her gaze sweep across the room. "If we, as attorneys, are afraid to fight for justice, then what's the point of any of this?" Silence. Finally, Denise Miller, her best friend and co-founder, leaned forward. "I stand with Camille." A few others nodded in agreement. Camille exhaled. "I won't force anyone to be part of this, but I'm moving forward, with or without this firm's backing." The meeting adjourned with mixed reactions, but Camille didn't wait for approval. She had work to do. Camille wasted no time assembling a powerful legal team, a group of attorneys who shared her passion for justice: civil rights specialists, constitutional law experts, investigators who had exposed police misconduct before. Together, they began building a rock-solid case against officers Carter and Dawson and the Maplewood Police Department. They pulled evidence of prior complaints against the two officers. They found witnesses from the park. They gathered expert testimony on racial profiling. This wasn't just a wrongful arrest lawsuit anymore. This was a civil rights battle that could set a legal precedent. And the community was paying attention. The viral video of Camille's arrest had sparked outrage. Local activists organized protests in front of the police department. College students invited Camille to speak about justice and systemic bias. She attended town hall meetings, where community members shared their own painful experiences with law enforcement. One night, after a particularly emotional gathering, Camille was walking to her car when she heard a hesitant voice behind her. "Miss Wright?" She turned to see a young woman, no older than 20, clutching her phone. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, her voice cracking, "for standing up to them, for standing up for all of us." Camille felt her throat tighten. This fight wasn't just hers. It belonged to every person who had been silenced, humiliated, or dismissed. She managed a small smile. "I'm just doing what I can." The police department fought back hard. Within weeks, their legal team filed a motion to dismiss Camille's lawsuit, claiming the officers had acted within protocol. It was a predictable move, one meant to delay, frustrate, and intimidate her into backing down. Her attorney, Elijah Carter, called with the news. "We expected this," Camille said, pacing her office. "We'll counter it." Elijah hesitated. "There's something else." Camille stopped. "What?" There was a pause before he said it. "You've been assigned as the judge for an upcoming internal misconduct hearing." Camille frowned. "What does that have to do with—" Elijah exhaled. "The defendants are officers Carter and Dawson." The room felt suddenly smaller. Camille sank into her chair, processing the irony. Weeks ago, these officers had humiliated her, arrested her, treated her as though she didn't belong. And now she would sit on the judge's bench, deciding their fate. News of Camille's assignment spread fast. The misconduct hearing wasn't directly related to her case against the officers. It involved a different excessive force complaint. But the symbolism was undeniable. On the morning of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Journalists whispered, their pens poised. Spectators filled the seats, their eyes full of expectation. At the defendant's table, Carter and Dawson sat in their uniforms, their bodies stiff. They whispered to each other, their faces pale with unease. Then the doors to the judge's chambers opened. Camille stepped out. Dressed in black judicial robes, she walked to the bench with quiet authority. A hush fell over the room. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and looked directly at the officers. Carter's face drained of color. Dawson swallowed hard. Camille let the weight of the moment settle before speaking. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." Her voice was calm, steady, commanding. She watched as the officers sat stiffly, their confidence shaken. For the first time in weeks, Camille felt the upper hand. But this wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. The air inside the Maplewood courthouse was thick with anticipation. Every seat in the courtroom was filled. Reporters lined the back wall, and the low hum of murmurs created an undercurrent of tension. The hearing of officers James Carter and Michael Dawson had drawn more attention than expected. At the defendant's table, Carter and Dawson sat in their pressed uniforms, exchanging hushed remarks. They carried themselves with an air of nonchalance, smirking as if this was just another procedural hearing, another minor hurdle to clear. They expected a quick dismissal, a light slap on the wrist before they returned to their jobs. But then, the doors to the judge's chambers swung open. The room fell dead silent. Camille strode in, her black robe flowing behind her as she ascended the bench with quiet authority. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. Her face was composed, her presence commanding. Then she looked directly at the defendants. Carter's smirk vanished. His face paled, his mouth slightly agape. Dawson's hands gripped the table, his fingers tightening as he shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched. It was her. The woman they had humiliated. The woman they had arrested without cause. Now, she was sitting in the judge's chair. For the first time, they looked genuinely unsettled. Camille let the weight of the moment settle before speaking. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The shuffle of bodies settling into their seats was the only sound in the room. Camille picked up the case file in front of her, flipping through it with practiced ease. She didn't rush, nor did she linger. When she spoke again, her tone was even and authoritative. "We are here today to review allegations of excessive force in an incident involving officers James Carter and Michael Dawson. The charges against them will be presented, and all parties will have the opportunity to be heard." She lifted her gaze once more, letting it rest on the two men. "This will be a fair and impartial hearing. I expect all involved to conduct themselves accordingly." Carter and Dawson sat rigidly, their confidence visibly fracturing. They weren't used to this dynamic. The prosecutor stood, clearing his throat before addressing the court. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Officers Carter and Dawson used unjustified force during an encounter with an unarmed citizen, violating department policy and constitutional rights. Their actions were not only excessive, but indicative of a troubling pattern." Camille listened, her expression unreadable. As the witnesses were called, the similarities between this case and her own experience became disturbingly clear. The victim, a young man named Ethan Morales, took the stand. His voice wavered as he recounted the night he was pulled over for a broken taillight. "I didn't even have time to explain," he said, his hands trembling. "They yanked me out of my car, slammed me against the hood. I told them I wasn't resisting, but they just kept yelling at me to stop fighting." Camille's grip on her pen tightened. The same words Carter had used on her. The prosecutor pressed further. "Did you, at any point, refuse to comply?" "No." Ethan swallowed hard. "I did exactly what they said, but it didn't matter. They already decided I was guilty." A tense silence filled the courtroom. At the defense table, Carter shifted uncomfortably. He glanced up, stealing a quick look at Camille. She saw something different in his expression now. Guilt. During recess, Carter and Dawson stood near the hallway, their voices low but tense. "How the hell is she the judge?" Carter whispered, barely containing his frustration. "This has to be a setup," Dawson muttered, shaking his head. Their lawyer sighed. "It's not a setup. It's coincidence. But you need to stay focused." Carter exhaled sharply, his nerves showing for the first time. "She's not going to be fair. Actually, she's been more fair than you ever were to her," the lawyer shot back. They had nothing to say to that. When the court reconvened, the prosecutor wasted no time dismantling the officer's defense. "Officer Carter, did you believe Mr. Morales posed an immediate threat?" Carter hesitated. "At the time, yes. He was unarmed, standing still and following orders. How was he a threat?" Carter's jaw twitched. "I made a judgment call." "And would you make that same judgment call today?" A long pause. Finally, Carter exhaled. "No." The courtroom murmured. When Dawson took the stand, the prosecutor pressed further. "Did you consider alternative methods before using force?" Dawson's lips parted, but no words came. The prosecutor leaned forward. "Or did you decide before you even heard him speak?" Dawson dropped his gaze. Camille watched it all unfold, her face betraying no emotion. But inside, she felt something shift. This wasn't just about punishment. This was about accountability. For the first time, Carter and Dawson were forced to grapple with the consequences of their unchecked power. By the end of the day, the officer's composure was gone. They sat stiffly at the defense table, their eyes hollow. The weight of the evidence, the testimony, and Camille's presence had chipped away at their arrogance. They were no longer in control of the narrative. Camille took a deep breath before striking the gavel. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. As the courtroom emptied, Carter and Dawson lingered near the exit, hesitating as if they wanted to say something. In the end, they didn't. They walked out quietly, their steps heavier than before. For Camille, the real challenge wasn't over. The question wasn't just whether they would be punished, it was whether real justice could finally prevail. The courtroom was silent as Camille stepped onto the bench the following morning. The atmosphere was different now, charged, expectant, tense. The case had gripped the public's attention, and the final ruling would determine not just the fate of officers Carter and Dawson, but whether justice would truly be served. As she arranged the case files before her, Camille's expression remained calm, unreadable. She had spent sleepless nights deliberating this verdict, not because she was unsure of what was right, but because she understood that this decision carried weight beyond just this courtroom. At the defense table, Carter and Dawson sat rigid, their faces drawn. Gone was the overconfidence they had displayed at the beginning. Now, they looked like men waiting for judgment. Camille lifted her gavel and spoke. "This court will now reconvene. Officers Carter and Dawson, after reviewing all evidence, testimony, and legal precedent, I am prepared to issue a ruling." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. Her voice remained even, but firm. "The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve the community with integrity, fairness, and respect. When that trust is violated, it erodes not just individual lives, but the entire foundation of public safety. This case has made clear that your actions on the night in question, like so many others before it, were not only unjustified, but indicative of a troubling pattern of abuse." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Camille continued. "With that in mind, I am imposing the following disciplinary measures." She met their eyes, ensuring they absorbed every word. First, officers Carter and Dawson will be placed on an unpaid suspension for a period of 6 months. During this time, they will not serve in any official capacity as law enforcement officers. A few gasps echoed through the room. Carter and Dawson stiffened in their seats, their jaws tightening, but they didn't interrupt. Second, before returning to duty, you will be required to complete an extensive retraining program on racial bias, de-escalation tactics, and the appropriate use of force. Your performance will be monitored, and failure to meet the standards set forth will result in termination. She let that sit for a moment before delivering the final blow. Lastly, a formal disciplinary record will be placed in both of your files. This will remain on record permanently, ensuring that any future misconduct will be reviewed in light of your previous actions. The weight of the ruling settled over the room. It was a strict but fair punishment, one that would not only hold them accountable, but also prevent them from easily evading responsibility in the future. Carter and Dawson sat motionless. Camille could see it in their eyes, the realization that, for once, they weren't walking away unscathed. The room remained still as Camille struck her gavel against the wood. "This court is adjourned." Chairs scraped against the floor as people stood. Some exchanged looks of satisfaction, others of relief. Reporters hurried to the exits, eager to break the news. Camille gathered her notes, preparing to leave, when she noticed hesitation at the defendant's table. Carter wasn't leaving. Instead, he stood there, his eyes shifting as if battling an internal war. Finally, he took a slow step toward the bench. Dawson watched him, but said nothing. Camille remained still as Carter met her gaze. He cleared his throat, then spoke, his voice lower than before, quieter, stripped of arrogance. "Judge Wright, He hesitated. I'm sorry." For a moment, Camille said nothing. She searched his face, looking for genuine regret or just an empty attempt at redemption. She acknowledged the words with a slight nod, but that was all, because she knew words meant nothing without action. Carter seemed to understand that too. He didn't expect forgiveness. He simply turned and left, Dawson following close behind. The courtroom slowly emptied. The weight of the case, of everything that had led to this moment, still hung in the air. Camille remained seated at the bench, letting out a slow breath. This was justice, but it wasn't the end. For every case like this that saw the light of day, countless others never did. For every officer held accountable, others continued unchecked. She had won this battle, but the war for justice was ongoing. And she was far from done fighting. The verdict sent ripples across the city. News outlets debated its significance. Activists demanded more accountability, and public discussions on police reform gained newfound momentum. For Camille, the fight didn't stop in the courtroom. She used her growing platform to push for real change, advocating for policy reforms, transparency in law enforcement, and better training programs to prevent future abuses of power. Town hall meetings became a regular part of her schedule, where she listened to victims, community leaders, and even officers who wanted to do better. At one such meeting, an elderly woman approached her, gripping Camille's hands tightly. "You don't know what this means to us," the woman said, tears welling in her eyes. "You gave us hope." Camille smiled softly, but remained clear-eyed. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We have so much more work to do." Later that evening, standing on the courthouse steps, Camille watched as a group of young activists gathered for a peaceful protest. Their voices were steady, their signs bold, with messages of justice. She felt something rare. Hope. Justice was possible, but only if people kept fighting for it.